Welcome to one of the most unsettling mysteries ever buried in the quiet hills of Arkansas. Before we dive in, drop a comment telling us where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. We're always curious when and where these lost stories find their audience. The settlement known as Arkansas Hills was never supposed to be remembered. Hidden deep in the wooded valleys of northwest Arkansas, it appeared on maps only between 1868 and 1874, before fading into the borders of what became Benton County. Today, all that's left are faint stone ruins buried under decades of forest growth near the White River's eastern bank. Most places like this vanish without a trace, their stories dying with the last people who remembered them. But not this one. Some stories fight to stay alive, even when someone tries to erase them. In the fall of 1962, historian Dr. Margaret Holloway stumbled upon strange gaps while researching early frontier churches. Her attention was caught by repeated references to something called the Lawson Chapel incident in Baptist correspondence from 1872 to 1874. Oddly enough, there was no official record of such a chapel anywhere. It was as if it had been deliberately erased from history. In her research notes still stored in the University of Arkansas archives, Dr. Holloway wrote, "The absence itself speaks volumes. This is no accident. It's intent." Her search led her to a small museum in Rogers, where she found a damaged 1870 map marking a Lawson meeting house near Timber Creek Road, about 7 miles northeast of Bentonville. What began as academic curiosity turned into a 6-month obsession that lasted until her sudden retirement in 1963, officially due to health reasons. The material she collected, church ledgers, letters, newspaper clippings, and local testimonies, was sealed away until 1968, then microfilmed. The original papers were reportedly lost during a 1969 campus renovation. What survived offers only fragments, but those fragments suggest something deeply wrong happened almost a century before. The story traces back to Reverend Thomas Lawson, who arrived in early 1871. Land records show he bought 5 acres from a man named Joseph Hardin that March. The deed described wooded land with a natural spring perfect for worship gatherings. Lawson claimed to be a preacher from Tennessee, but later checks revealed no record of his ministry there. By April 1871, construction began. A local paper, the short-lived Arkansas Hills Gazette, described a fine timber church rising under Lawson's supervision. The Reverend, a bachelor of scholarly demeanor, has shown great skill in both carpentry and spirit, it wrote that June. By September, the chapel was finished and dedicated, with nearly 40 local families attending. It wasn't a typical frontier church. Its ceiling was unusually high, with exposed oak beams arranged in geometric patterns. Lawson said, enhanced acoustics. The windows were small and high-set with colored glass imported from St. Louis, and the pulpit sat in the center, surrounded by pews in a semicircle. It was as if the whole building had been designed for something different. Lawson told curious churchgoers that his design ensured every word of Scripture would reach each listener equally. The chapel's remote location seemed no accident either. Though technically within Arkansas Hills, it sat nearly a mile from the closest neighbor, perched where Timber Creek flowed out from a limestone ridge. Settlers had long known that spring, it ran clear and cold all year round, as if untouched by the seasons. What happened there over the next 15 months would become the core of a mystery stitched together from fading memories, old letters, and the eerie silences left behind. One of the last people alive to remember it was Sarah Millbrook, who spoke with Dr. Holloway in 1962. She was 96 then, but as a child of 8, she had spent nearly a year attending Lawson's services with her parents. Her memories were fragmented, but lined up with other evidence Holloway had uncovered. The Reverend, she said, was tall and solemn, his hands oddly large for his frame, He always looked polished, and when he spoke, people listened, even if his words didn't quite make sense. The chapel always smelled of pine sap and beeswax, and beneath it, Lawson claimed lay a cellar where the baptismal waters were blessed. At first, services felt like any other church gathering. Families sang hymns, prayed, and listened to scripture. But over time, things began to shift. It started subtly, a new hymn here, a different prayer there. By Christmas of 1871, everything had changed. Lawson had the congregation stand in chalk-marked patterns on the floor, repeating strange phrases again and again. Some nights when the moon was full, people swore they could hear music drifting from the chapel, even though no service had been called. Sarah's father forbade her from going back after February, the night Mrs. Langley collapsed mid-sermon, convulsing and shouting words no one understood. Lawson called it the First Awakening and seemed thrilled by it. Outwardly, he remained a respected figure. He led Sunday worship, midweek prayer circles, charity suppers, and women's gatherings, earning admiration from most of the community. But as Dr. Holloway later noted, even in the most polite descriptions of him, there was a faint but unmistakable discomfort, something off that no one could quite name. That unease became clear in a letter dated November 1871, written by visiting minister Edwin Campbell to his superior in Little Rock. Brother Lawson's theology. Campbell wrote, contains elements difficult to reconcile with our doctrine. His talk of vessels of divine purpose and flesh as sacred instrument feels drawn from sources beyond Holy Scripture. Campbell mentioned that Lawson spoke of ancient wisdom recovered and private revelations, and that his study contained books in languages he couldn't recognize, neither Greek nor Hebrew, but something older. When Campbell asked about them, Lawson said they were tongues that shaped the waters of creation and claimed modern Bibles captured only the ripples, not the depths. Most unsettling of all, Campbell described a strange instrument in Lawson's quarters, something like an organ, but fitted with metal tubes that ran into jars of water. When asked about it, Lawson smiled and said it was used to call those who dwell in deeper harmonies. Even the chapel itself, Campbell noted, seemed to hum with those same odd vibrations. According to architectural notes later recovered from Reverend Lawson's personal journal, the chapel was no ordinary frontier building. A surviving entry dated May 14, 1871, reveals his insistence on exact measurements 33 feet long, 21 feet wide, and 12 feet high at the center. The alignment with the spring is essential, he wrote. The waters must flow beneath the altar space where the resonance is strongest. A July 3rd entry recorded during construction shows how fixated he'd become on the underground features. Workers had questioned the need for heavy stonework around the spring, arguing that a wooden enclosure would suffice. Lawson dismissed them by claiming it kept the baptismal waters pure. But in truth, as his journal makes clear, he believed the limestone amplified subtle vibrations that common ears cannot detect. Once the correct frequencies were achieved, he wrote, the boundaries between water and flesh become permeable. By January 1872, the chapel had become the center of life in Arkansas Hills, drawing nearly 70 regular worshipers, a large share of the local population, and even visitors from neighboring settlements who came to hear Lawson's increasingly unorthodox sermons. One such sermon, partially transcribed in the diary of Elizabeth Hardin, the wife of the man who sold Lawson the land, offers a window into his evolving theology. The Reverend spoke today of the voice in the waters, she wrote. He said our bodies are like the chapel itself, vessels built to specific proportions designed to resonate with divine harmonies. He spoke of the sacred geography of flesh and how some are chosen as perfect instruments. Elizabeth noted how this strange language unsettled some like Mrs. Tunney, even as others, including the Mercers and the Whitfields, seemed deeply moved. A later entry dated January 18, 1872, records a clear split within the congregation. Those who embraced the Reverend's new teachings stayed after regular services for what he called deeper communion. Emerging hours later, dazed eyes dilated, their movements slow and fluid, whispering about the singing beneath. Elizabeth's husband urged her to keep her distance, but she admitted feeling drawn to understand what changed them so profoundly. "The Reverend watches me now during services," she wrote, "as if measuring my potential for something I cannot name." By February 1872, the first written concerns surfaced. Local physician and chapel member Dr. James Whitfield sent a letter to a medical colleague in Fayetteville describing unusual symptoms among several congregants. They reported identical disturbances, persistent ringing in the ears at night, vivid dreams they hesitated to recount, and a shared belief that these were not ailments, but awakenings. Lawson, it seemed, encouraged this view as a sign of spiritual elevation. Whitfield described visiting the Mercer family, once ordinary farmers, but now nearly living at the chapel. All three, Jacob, Rebecca, and their adult son Thomas, had lost significant weight. Their skin looked unusually pale, their movements oddly fluid, as if their joints had been somehow altered. Most unsettling was their synchronized speech. They finished each other's sentences or spoke in unison without any apparent coordination. When Whitfield mentioned it, they simply smiled in the same way and said, "The waters have aligned us." He suspected a form of mass delusion, possibly worsened by contamination of the spring used during rituals. By March 1872, nearly a third of the congregation was reportedly experiencing similar awakenings. Community records from that spring paint a picture of a chapel no longer serving as a simple meeting house, but as the center of an intense and secretive movement. By March 1872, some members were attending daily prayer sessions that stretched long into the night. The cellar, originally meant for storage and baptismal preparations, had become the site of Lawson's private ceremonies for those he called awakened, a group who increasingly separated themselves from the rest of the congregation. One of the few surviving church documents, a partial ledger, lists 27 names under the heading "Vessels prepared between March and July 1872. Next to each name appear cryptic notes like "waters received" and "resonance achieved," but no explanations. More chilling was a personal notebook, apparently Lawson's own, that Dr. Holloway found decades later among the belongings of Joseph Hardin, who had salvaged it after the chapel's destruction. Inside were intricate anatomical sketches of the human ear, throat, and skull, annotated with terms like primary resonance chambers and secondary amplification structures. One page shows a cross-section of a head with the auditory canals highlighted and modified alongside the note. After sufficient exposure to the frequencies, the physical restructuring begins naturally. The waters reshape their vessels from within opening channels between worlds that mundane flesh normally blocks. The first disappearance followed soon after. On a Wednesday night in April 1872, Jackson Mercer, a 42-year-old farmer and devoted chapel member, vanished after attending one of Lawson's late services. Lawson told the congregation Mercer had received a divine calling to take the ministry to another settlement and had departed at once, leaving his possessions behind as an act of faith plausible enough on the frontier where sudden missionary work wasn't unheard of. But a letter dated April 29th from Jackson's wife Rebecca to her sister in Missouri suggests something far stranger. In it, she confides that the Reverend gave her a letter supposedly written by Jackson, describing his work in a new community near the territorial line. But she didn't recognize the handwriting or the phrasing. When I mentioned this, she wrote, "The Reverend smiled in that way he has, as if listening to something beyond my hearing, and said that the waters change how a man forms his thoughts. I do not know what to make of this, but I find myself unable to sleep without hearing what sounds like Jackson's voice, calling from somewhere beneath the floorboards of our home." Her letter also hints at her own transformation. I've started to hear the singing the others described, not with my ears exactly, but somewhere deeper, she wrote. The Reverend says this is normal, that the waters call to those ready to hear. Thomas hears it too, more clearly than I do. He sits for hours by the creek, flowing from the chapel spring, fingers trailing in the current. His skin has become strangely translucent between the fingers, where I can almost see the bones beneath. The Reverend says this is a sign of his readiness. We are scheduled for immersion next week. Afterward, the Reverend says we will better understand Jackson's journey. Over the next 2 months, activity at the chapel intensified. Services were held almost daily, and Lawson began openly preaching a new doctrine he called the communion of waters and flesh, which he described as the hidden truth behind baptism. According to later accounts from those who left the congregation, Lawson taught that the spring beneath the chapel possessed special properties capable of awakening the dormant harmony of the body once a person was properly prepared. Preparation meant fasting for 3 days, followed by night-long services of repetitive chanting and what witnesses described as strange otherworldly music played on a modified reed organ whose pipes extended into the spring-fed stone basin in the cellar. The final step was immersion in the waters, while Lawson placed his hands on what he called sacred points of resonance. A surviving journal fragment dated May 12, 1872, reveals how far these experiments had gone. The Whitfield woman progresses rapidly, Lawson wrote. After only 3 immersions, the transformation has begun along her neck and hands. The membranes are forming cleanly, without the unfortunate calcification that occurred with subject 4, presumably Jackson Mercer. The integration of the resonance chambers with her existing auditory structures proceeds as theorized. She can now perceive the full spectrum of the deeper harmonies, not merely the surface vibrations that the untransformed mistake for ordinary sound. Her husband grows suspicious despite his own partial awakening. His scientific mind resists full surrender to the waters. This entry marked a chilling turning point, evidence, not of a minister tending to souls, but of a man conducting a methodical experiment on his congregation, one that blurred the line between faith science and something far more alien. By the summer of 1872, the outward image of a thriving congregation had dissolved into something far darker. Reverend Lawson's private writings show his thinking had become clinical, even predatory. He must either advance to complete immersion soon or be removed from the congregation. One journal fragment reads, referring to Dr. Whitfield, "His position makes him either a valuable vessel or a dangerous impediment." By June, 3 more members, Eliza Whitfield, Thomas Garner, and Mary Sutton, vanished following special cellar ceremonies. As with Jackson Mercer, Lawson produced letters claiming each had departed for missionary work. But decades later, Dr. Holloway could find no record of their arrival in any settlement. Dr. Whitfield, reeling from his wife's disappearance, began documenting his doubts. In a June 24, 1872 journal entry, he wrote, "I can no longer silence my professional judgment. What I first took for religious fervor now presents as symptoms of prolonged exposure to an unknown toxin. Persistent oral disturbances, pupil dilation, elevated pulse, and eventual personality transformation suggest a physiological rather than spiritual cause. I have taken samples from the chapel spring for analysis, though I must do so discreetly. Lawson watches me with increasing suspicion, claiming my scientific inquiry represents a failure of faith." That night, Whitfield dreamed of Eliza not as departed on mission, but somehow still present beneath the chapel floor. Her voice distorted as if speaking through water. A July 2nd entry reveals his investigation had deepened. The water, he wrote, contained unusual mineral content and high concentrations of compounds I cannot identify with my limited equipment. More disturbing were organic structures suspended in the water, microscopic architectural rather than biological. They respond to sound vibrations, reorganizing themselves under certain frequencies. He had also managed to enter Thomas Garner's abandoned home, where he found a journal hidden under the floorboards. Early entries echoed other congregants' experiences, auditory phenomena, vivid dreams, altered perception. Later pages became rambling and graphic. The spaces between my fingers fill with translucent tissue. My throat expands to accommodate new structures. I can feel the vibrations reorganizing my inner ear. The final entry read only, "The water no longer feels wet to me. It feels like home." Whitfield resolved to bring his findings to county authorities, though he feared being dismissed as insane. As summer wore on, regular Sunday attendance shrank, while the inner circle of awakened members became increasingly isolated and secretive. Neighbors began whispering about Arkansas hills. Residents changed, speaking in riddles about waters and vessels. Several families quietly moved away, refusing to explain their reasons. Then in July came the most shocking disappearance yet. The entire Tunney family, Harold, Martha, and their adolescent son, William. This time Lawson offered no letters. When pressed by worried townsfolk, he reportedly said only that the family had achieved perfect resonance and would speak through the waters when the time is proper. That explanation was the breaking point. Joseph Hardin, who had originally sold Lawson the land, joined 7 other prominent citizens to draft a petition to regional Baptist leaders. The petition, later uncovered by Dr. Holloway in denominational archives, cited unorthodox practices, unexplained absences, and alterations to the chapel inconsistent with its approved design. Through Whitfield's clandestine efforts, those alterations came into focus. Maintaining a pretense of loyalty, he gained access to the chapel one evening while Lawson was away. His hasty notes, found among his effects years later, describe a scene more like a ritual complex than a house of worship. The pews had been rearranged in concentric circles around a central opening roughly 3 feet across, covered with a wooden lid when not in use. This opening dropped straight into the cellar below. The walls of the chapel were carved with repeating figures, human forms entangled with wave-like designs. The cellar had been drastically altered. The natural spring now fed a circular basin about 12 feet in diameter of unknown depth, its surface reflecting no light, despite appearing clear. Channels in the floor radiated outward to 7 alcoves cut into the earthen walls, each holding what appeared to be sleeping pallets, stained and odorous from some other use. The modified reed organ extended down from the chapel with pipes plunging directly into the water. Along the eastern wall stood shelves lined with glass jars containing specimens. Whitfield hesitated to identify, but which appeared to be human tissue, each labeled with the names of missing congregants. Nearby was an extensive collection of anatomical texts in unfamiliar languages, with pages marked on the human auditory system and neural structures. Whitfield managed to take additional water samples and 1 specimen jar for analysis, a desperate attempt to gather evidence before events spiraled further out of control. By late summer of 1872, what had begun as whispers of odd practices had hardened into full-scale horror. Dr. Whitfield's final notes, recovered only in fragments, show a man torn between duty and dread. "I fear I have remained silent too long," he wrote. "Professional courtesy and natural skepticism have overridden what I now recognize as clear evidence of profound wrongdoing." In a hastily scrawled addendum, Whitfield recorded his most disturbing discovery, a hidden chamber beyond the northern alcove of the cellar, its entrance disguised behind a shelving unit. Inside, he found what he called cultivation tanks, glass vessels large enough to hold an adult human filled with spring water and threaded with a network of tubes. 3 of the tanks were occupied. The submerged figures were recognizably human, but grotesquely altered limbs, elongated webbing. Stretched between fingers and toes, translucent skin, revealing new internal structures. One of the beings opened its eyes as Whitfield approached. He recognized the distorted features of his wife Eliza. Her eyes tracked him, her hand pressed against the glass, its fingers fused by translucent membranes. She appeared to be breathing without air. Before he could examine further, he heard movement above, replaced the shelving, and fled. His notes end with a chilling line. "We'll contact County Sheriff tomorrow with complete evidence." He never got the chance. On August 2nd, 1872, a fire consumed his home office, killing him and destroying most of his records. The constable ruled the blaze accidental, blaming an overturned lamp, but no mention was made of any specimen jars or documents retrieved. An entry from Elizabeth Hardin's diary the next day suggests otherwise. Dr. Whitfield's death has cast a pall over the community. Joseph suspects the chapel devotees. He swears Thomas Garner's brother was seen near the doctor's home just before the fire. She adds that the local constable himself, a regular at Lawson's private services, dismisses such talk. Meanwhile, Reverend Morrison of the Regional Baptist Association had promised a visit. "I pray he arrives before others disappear," Elizabeth wrote. "The creek from the chapel spring now carries a strange odor. Fish are found dead along its banks. Something unnatural festers in our community." Following Whitfield's death, Lawson's behavior shifted dramatically. Gone was the careful veneer of respectability. Services became restricted to his inner circle of about 15 awakened followers. The chapel windows were shrouded in dark cloth. Neighbors reported strange noises at night, mechanical hums, rhythmic chanting, and a sound like distant singing heard underwater. Regional Baptist authorities finally acted, dispatching Reverend Caleb Morrison to Arkansas Hills. His official report, filed September 10, 1872, was perfunctory. The chapel's activities were within acceptable doctrinal boundaries, and missing persons accounted for through correspondence. But a private letter from Morrison to Bishop Edwin Hargrove, discovered by Dr. Holloway nearly a century later, tells a different story. I write separately from my official report. Morrison began as what I witnessed extends beyond what I can commit to the record, without risking both credibility and unnecessary alarm. He described a chapel altered beyond recognition, and a Lawson who appeared physically transformed, gaunt, his movements and speech unsettling his theology. A fusion of pagan water worship and pseudoscientific theories about the human body as a resonant vessel for ancient harmonies. Morrison was denied full access to the cellar, but saw enough from the stairs to call it a ritual chamber centered around the natural spring. The water, he wrote, appears unnaturally still and dark. When disturbed by Lawson's hand, it produced sounds that affected me physically, a vibration felt not in the ears, but within the skull itself. Of the missing Morrison found no direct proof, but heard sounds from behind a sealed door, suggesting human presence. When confronted, Lawson claimed they had joined with the waters and would emerge perfected when the resonance reaches completion. Morrison's official report dismissed community fears as rumor. His private letter portrayed something unspeakable taking shape beneath the chapel, a transformation no scripture could sanction. By the fall of 1872, even Reverend Morrison, a seasoned clergyman accustomed to frontier eccentricities, had reached a breaking point. In his confidential correspondence to Bishop Hargrove, he wrote, "I believe something terrible occurs in that place, yet find myself unable to articulate specific charges that would warrant official intervention." His letter, dated mid-September, reads like the confession of a man already haunted. He described disturbing dreams during his 2 nights in the settlement, and an unexplained ringing in his ears that persisted after his return. "I recommend no further official contact with Lawson or his congregation," he wrote. "Instead, I suggest quiet consultation with territorial authorities regarding possible legal violations beyond our ecclesiastical concern. Whatever transpires at Lawson Chapel, I fear it extends beyond heresy into darker territory. In public, he maintained the fiction of normalcy, believing open scrutiny might trigger flight or provoke violence from Lawson and his inner circle. A second private letter to Hargrove, dated September 30th, shows how deeply the exposure had marked him. The auditory disturbances I mentioned previously have intensified, Morrison wrote. I now hear what seems to be distant singing at all hours, particularly when near running water. My physician finds no physical cause and calls it nervous exhaustion. More disturbing are the dream's vivid visions of submerged chambers where human forms undergo impossible transformations. In these dreams, Lawson appears as a guide, explaining that what I witness is the future evolution of the species and that all waters eventually flow to the same ocean. I fear my brief exposure to whatever occurs at Lawson Chapel has affected me in ways I cannot fully comprehend. Morrison requested reassignment as far from Arkansas as possible, convinced that distance was his only remedy. Despite his recommendation for law enforcement involvement, no action was taken. Records suggest Bishop Hargrove, worried about scandal and credibility, chose to handle the matter internally. That decision proved catastrophic. On the night of October 17, 1872, a violent storm lashed northwestern Arkansas. Weather records show more than 7 inches of rain fell in under 6 hours, flooding the White River and its tributaries, including Timber Creek, which flowed directly beneath Lawson Chapel. What happened that night can only be reconstructed from fragmentary accounts. The most detailed comes from Samuel Greer, who lived a mile downstream. In a statement to a local newspaper in 1875, later preserved by Dr. Holloway, Greer recalled, "I was securing my livestock when I noticed the creek water had turned peculiar, darker than any storm runoff with an oily sheen that caught what little light remained. More unsettling was the sound. Above the storm, I could hear what seemed like voices carried in the water itself, not shouting as drowning might cause, but singing in a manner I've never heard before or since. The flow carried unusual debris, not just branches and vegetation, but pieces of furniture, cloth hangings, and objects I couldn't identify in the darkness. Most disturbing was what I glimpsed when lightning lit the creek bed, human forms moving within the water. Not floating as drowned bodies, but propelling themselves against the current. Their movements were wrong, too fluid, with limbs bending in impossible ways. I glimpsed perhaps 5 or 6 such forms before losing my nerve and retreating indoors, where I remained until daybreak. The following morning, Greer ventured upstream. The banks were strewn with wreckage, splintered wood, torn fabric, waterlogged books filled with strange symbols. Among the debris, he found one object that chilled him most. A glass container like a specimen jar labeled Thomas Mercer. Inside was what he first assumed to be preserved tissue, but on closer inspection appeared to be a partially formed human ear with unnatural structural modifications. It was the only tangible evidence ever recovered of what took place at Lawson Chapel during the storm. A night when floodwaters tore through Timber Creek and something more than a church vanished beneath it. From that point on, Arkansas Hills ceased to appear on maps, and its story slipped into silence, waiting for someone like Dr. Holloway to piece it back together a century later. By the time the storm waters receded, the story of Lawson Chapel had shifted from rumor to whispered nightmare. In the most striking of the preserved accounts, the unnamed witness, likely Samuel Greer, described approaching the ruined chapel site at dawn, only to be stopped by Joseph Hardin and a group of men from the settlement. They told him the flood had revealed unnatural things and that they were handling the matter privately. Hardin confiscated the specimen jar Greer had found downstream and made him swear to silence. "I kept that promise until now," the witness later wrote, But the dreams of those fluid forms moving against the current have never ceased. I believe the community deserves to know what occurred at Lawson Chapel, even if the full truth proves too terrible for complete disclosure. What happened that morning was never recorded in official documents. But Hardin's personal diary, discovered decades later by Dr. Holloway, describes it with grim finality. According to Hardin, the chapel had partially collapsed into a sinkhole, where the spring had erupted during the storm, revealing the full extent of the hidden chambers beneath. The spring had become a surging pool, he wrote, filling most of the space. Along the walls were alcoves containing what I can only describe as cocoons, fashioned from a substance resembling hardened wax mixed with human hair. Several had ruptured from within. There was no sign of Reverend Lawson. In his private quarters, the men found journals documenting the transformation process, charts of how long each vessel required to achieve resonance, anatomical drawings, blending religious and scientific language, and names corresponding exactly to the missing congregants. Faced with what they had uncovered, Hardin recorded, "We made the only decision conscience would allow. We gathered all materials, sealed the remaining intact cocoons in the cellar, collapsed what remained of the structure upon it, and burned everything that would burn. Afterward, we agreed never to speak of what we had seen. Some horrors are best buried and forgotten." But an entry dated October 25th, 1872, reveals the men's actions may have failed. "The creek runs clear again," Hardin wrote, "but none will drink from it or use it for crops. Thomas Walsh's hunting dog refuses to cross the water, growling at nothing visible. Most disturbing was the discovery this morning footprints leading from the creek to William Reed's barn and back again. The prints showed no ordinary human foot, but something elongated with what appeared to be webbing between the toes. Reed claims to have heard singing in his well before dawn. "We have agreed to post watches at night until the first hard freeze, hoping winter will end, whatever escaped our efforts at the chapel site." The official record remains silent. It states only that the chapel was destroyed by storm damage and subsequently abandoned, with no deaths recorded, because Lawson's remaining followers were already documented as missionaries. Yet in the months after the storm, the settlement of Arkansas Hills quickly unraveled. Families relocated without explanation. By 1874, the area was virtually deserted, absorbed into expanding county territories. This would have remained a half-remembered local legend had Dr. Margaret Holloway not stumbled across those scattered references to the Lawson Chapel incident in 1962. Her work unearthed not only the suppressed story of the chapel's rise and destruction, but also a troubling epilogue. Between 1873 and 1875, scattered reports emerged from communities along the White River watershed downstream from the site. People spoke of strange figures appearing near the water after heavy rains. Individuals whose voices echoed as if through water, and whose movements seemed too fluid, too graceful to be normal. When questioned, these strangers often gave names, matching those who had disappeared from Arkansas Hills, yet claimed no knowledge of the settlement or the chapel. In piecing together these fragments, Holloway concluded that whatever Lawson had begun in that hidden cellar did not end with the storm. The waters may have carried his work downstream, dispersing something people, organisms, or both into the river system. The official records closed the book on Lawson Chapel in 1872. The ripples it left behind suggest the story was far from over. By the end of 1873, the story of Lawson Chapel had already slipped into legend, but the traces it left downstream were impossible to ignore. One of the most chilling pieces of evidence came from a December 1873 report filed by a physician in Fayetteville. He described treating a woman found unconscious near the White River, whose body bore anatomical anomalies inconsistent with normal human physiology. Her hands displayed translucent membranous webbing between the fingers. her joints bent with unusual elasticity as though ligaments had been reshaped. And her ear canals contained structures suggesting intentional surgical alteration. The official report stops there. But Dr. Holloway, combing medical school archives almost a century later, found the physician's private notes. They describe a patient with a body temperature nearly 10 degrees below normal, but no sign of hypothermia and a respiration rate of roughly 1 breath per minute, physiological adaptations that should have been impossible. Most striking were the changes within her auditory canals, extra membranes and resonating chambers designed, as the physician speculated, to perceive sound frequencies well beyond normal human hearing, especially those conducted through water. The woman regained consciousness mid-examination. Before staff could restrain her, she spoke her words hard to understand, but referencing rejoining the congregation and the calling of deeper waters. She named Thomas Lawson, calling him the vessel that brought the song. Then she escaped, displaying a strength and flexibility beyond normal human limits. Witnesses reported her moving like something serpentine, dislocating joints to squeeze through narrow gaps before vanishing into the river and never resurfacing. By April 1874, law enforcement records documented the discovery of an abandoned camp along the White River, about 30 miles downstream from Arkansas Hills. The site contained artifacts eerily similar to those described in Dr. Whitfield's lost notes. Glass containers of unknown contents, modified musical instruments, and journals written in cipher. A detailed map marked specific locations along the river system, including several populated areas hinting at planned movement or expansion. Investigators also noted unusual footprints leading in and out of the water, as though the camp's occupants traveled primarily by river rather than land. Then came the fisherman's testimony that still appears in Holloway's files. Thomas Reed claimed that in the spring of 1874, he encountered none other than Reverend Lawson on a lonely stretch of the White River. I knew him by the description, though changed, Reed wrote. He spoke of gathering his congregation and how the waters would carry their song beyond the territory. When I asked his name, he smiled, showing teeth too numerous, and said, "I am the vessel that brings the water's resonance." Reed fled, but not before seeing at least 7 figures partially submerged in the shallows. Their forms blended with the water, moving too smoothly, too fluidly to be human. They were singing, Reed wrote, though I hesitate to call it music as humans make it. The sound bypassed my ears, vibrating directly in my skull. I felt a powerful urge to enter the water and approach them, an urge I resisted only by thinking of my wife and children at home. As he retreated, Lawson called after him, "The waters connect all things. You've heard our song now. Eventually, you'll follow it to its source." For weeks after, Reed reported hearing that same singing whenever he was near running water, though it faded with time. His statement, recorded by a local editor, but never printed, became just one of many scattered accounts of strange water people appearing along the White River in the following years. In 1875, Territorial Governor Elisha Baxter even wrote to federal authorities about unusual transients and requested assistance in examining remains with anatomical anomalies recovered near Beaver Creek. No federal response survives in the record. By 1963, after combing these fragments, Dr. Holloway had come to a stark conclusion. Her final entry, dated June 4th, reads, "The pattern of downstream encounters suggests the possibility that whatever occurred in that chapel cellar achieved some form of continuation beyond the destruction of the site. The consistent descriptions of auditory phenomena in both contemporary and later accounts suggest that sound vibration was the key to whatever process Lawson developed." Among her last notes was a sketch she labeled "Theoretical Modifications to Human Auditory Structures," drawn from 19th century descriptions and implying a transformation not just of bodies, but of perception itself, an evolution carried forward not by creed or contagion, but by water and sound. What emerges from Dr. Holloway's last surviving notes is a picture that feels less like history and more like a chain reaction still echoing through time. The illustration she left the one archivist described as disturbing shows an altered human inner ear with additional resonating chambers extending into the sinus cavities and throat. Next to it, she wrote a line that distills everything she had pieced together. If sound serves as the primary vector of transformation, the implications extend far beyond conventional modes of influence. A specific frequency or harmonic pattern properly amplified and directed through water, as a conducting medium, might theoretically induce physiological changes in susceptible individuals. Lawson appears to have discovered or developed such a method, though, whether through genuine innovation or by drawing on sources unknown to conventional science, remains unclear. She had planned to visit the former chapel site to verify her hypothesis, but never made it. University records show that on the evening of June 4th, 1963, the same day as her final entry, she suffered a sudden medical emergency and was hospitalized for several weeks. Afterward, she resigned and relocated to Arizona. She never published again. Her hospital records, later released by her niece, describe acute auditory hallucinations and paranoid ideation centered on water. The attending physician noted she refused to bathe or drink without extensive testing and repeatedly said, "The waters remember, and they've noticed my attention." When her materials were finally cataloged in 1968, staff noted something strange. The audio recordings of Holloway's interviews with witnesses, Sarah Millbrook among them, had suffered unexplained water damage despite being stored in a climate-controlled environment. The few fragments salvageable contained unusual background sounds, described as distant choral singing at frequencies that caused physical discomfort when amplified. The archivist's report adds a footnote rarely seen in such documents. Multiple staff members began experiencing recurring dreams of being submerged in dark water and hearing voices calling their names. 2 requested reassignment after reporting persistent auditory phenomena, singing heard through walls, voices emanating from pipes. The archivist hesitated to suggest causation, but recorded the correlation to alert future researchers to potential psychological effects associated with prolonged exposure to this subject matter. By then, the site of Lawson Chapel was literally underwater. Construction of Beaver Lake in the 1960s had flooded the former Arkansas Hills settlement, submerging the chapel's location beneath roughly 20 feet of water. Yet even their stories persisted. Local fishing guides called it a dead spot for fishing, where electronic depth finders malfunction and emit what one described as voices trying to sing through the speaker. Park Ranger James Collins, interviewed unofficially by a university student in 1967, recounted an experience he refused to put in his official reports. During inspection rounds in '65, after the lake filled, I took a boat over what my map indicated was the old Arkansas Hill settlement, he said. The depth finder began emitting unusual sounds, not the standard pings, but something like choral music. The water around the boat darkened, even though the day was clear. I felt vibrations through the hull that resonated in my chest cavity rather than my ears. Most disturbing was the impression something was rising from the depths beneath the boat forms, almost human, distorted in proportion. I started the motor and left immediately. A week later, 2 teenagers swimming nearby disappeared. Their bodies were never recovered despite exhaustive searches. In 1969, just before Holloway's original materials were reportedly lost during campus renovations, a graduate student named Michael Collins, no relation to the ranger, made copies of several key documents for a planned thesis on frontier religious movements. He withdrew from the program that October for personal reasons. His roommate later told university staff that Collins had become obsessed with sound frequencies that could alter biological structures and was building makeshift audio equipment, which he placed in his bathtub during late-night experiments. Taken together, these fragments form a chilling continuity. The chapel may have been destroyed, but the process Lawson began, whether ritual science or something beyond, either appears to have survived, diffused into the waters, into sound itself. Holloway seemed to understand that at the end. Her resignation was not just retreat, but warning. The waters remember, she told colleagues. They've noticed my attention. By the time Michael Collins vanished in October 1969, the story of Lawson Chapel had stretched almost a century beyond its origin, transforming from a forgotten frontier scandal into an open-ended mystery of sound water and human change. When university housing staff cleared Collins's abandoned apartment, they found its walls covered with transcriptions from Reverend Lawson's recovered journals, anatomical drawings of modified auditory systems, and handwritten musical notations labeled approximated resonance patterns. In one of his last journal entries dated October 12th, Collins wrote, "I've managed to reconstruct what I believe to be the fundamental frequency Lawson utilized in his transformative process." His notes outlined mathematical relationships that matched acoustic properties, known to create standing wave patterns in enclosed bodies of water patterns that in theory could affect biological tissue through prolonged exposure. The next entry, October 15th, was far more cryptic. The water answered, "They've been waiting. I understand now what Lawson meant about vessels and resonance. The human form is merely a transitional stage. The waters have always been our true home, and they're calling us to return. I hear them clearly now, not just in my experiments, but in every drop of water from the shower, from the drinking fountain, from the condensation on my window. Tonight, I go to the lake. I've left copies of my key findings with Professor Marston, though I doubt he'll understand their significance until it's too late. The waters are rising not just physically, but in influence. Each person who hears the resonance becomes a new vessel to carry it further. Lawson was merely the first to understand, but he won't be the last." Collins never returned. A missing persons report was filed, but turned up nothing. The research materials he claimed to have left with Professor Marston were never found. Marston himself abruptly retired the following semester, moving to Colorado, where he reportedly refused to discuss Collins or his work with anyone. The last known reference to the Lawson Chapel incident appears in a private 1969 letter from Bishop Harold Matthews to the Regional Baptist Historical Society, responding to an inquiry about Dr. Holloway's research. His warning was unequivocal. "I would strongly advise against further investigation into this matter. Some episodes in our denominational history serve no constructive purpose in remembering. The decision to expunge certain records was made by our predecessors with what I believe to be sound judgment and genuine concern for the spiritual welfare of the broader community. There are ripples that continue long after the initial stone has sunk beneath the surface." Matthews then added a startlingly personal confession. "My own brief review of the partial documentation assembled by Dr. Holloway left me profoundly disturbed, not merely by the content itself, but by its persistent effects on my psychological well-being. For several weeks afterward, I experienced auditory phenomena that defied rational explanation, most notably the distinct impression of choral singing emanating from plumbing fixtures in my home. More disturbing was the recurring dream of standing before a congregation composed not of ordinary parishioners, but of figures only partially human. Their forms fluid, their voices resonating in harmonies beyond normal capacity. In this dream, I was not repulsed, but drawn toward them as if some part of me recognized their state as evolution, rather than aberration. I share this only to emphasize the seriousness of my recommendation. This matter should remain buried not from fear of institutional embarrassment, but from concern for the well-being of those who might be susceptible to whatever influence continues to radiate from this historical episode. Officially, the records remain expunged, The microfilm copies of Dr. Holloway's research are listed as damaged beyond recovery in university catalogs. What happened at Lawson Chapel in 1872 exists today only as scattered fragments, silenced witnesses, and inquiries deliberately discontinued by those who encountered it most directly. And yet perhaps the most unsettling aspect of all is that this erasure may not have been entirely successful. Even in its fragmented state, the narrative suggests that Lawson's work did not end with the collapse of the chapel, but may have dispersed into the waterways themselves, its influence traveling outward with every tributary carried by sound, waiting for someone susceptible enough to hear it. Water always moves, carrying what it holds to new places. Beneath the surface of Beaver Lake, the foundations of Lawson Chapel likely remain, along with whatever the fire and collapsed timbers could not destroy. The spring still feeds into the watershed of northwest Arkansas, but now its flow is mixed with a much larger reservoir. In 1973, a geological survey of Beaver Lake noted anomalies at the coordinates of the old Arkansas Hills settlement. Sonar mapping revealed a chamber extending nearly 30 feet below the lake bed, far deeper than any 1870s structure could have reached. More puzzling was a temperature differential in the water column above the formation nearly 8 degrees warmer than surrounding waters, despite its depth. A scheduled dive was canceled after repeated equipment malfunctions and unexplained audio interference with communications. An internal memo marked "not for public distribution" recorded that 2 members of the survey team had requested transfer after the initial survey of Area 17, the designation given to the Arkansas Hills location. Engineer Reynolds wrote of voices emerging from the shower drain and dreams of underwater singing. The memo concluded, "Recommend indefinite postponement of further investigation of Area 17 anomalies with appropriate notation in restricted access files to prevent inadvertent future authorization of research at this location." Even today, locals sometimes report strange sounds drifting across the water. On still nights, human voices singing without breath, audible only when one's ears are partially submerged. Wildlife officials note certain sections of the lake contain inexplicably few fish, despite favorable conditions. Swimmers describe feeling faint tugging sensations as if fingers were testing the skin from below. In the summer of 1968, 3 teenagers disappeared near the restricted area. Their friends said they were pulled down as if grabbed from beneath. When their bodies were recovered 3 days later, autopsy results were sealed. A nurse present later confided to a reporter that the remains showed unusual modifications to the throat and ear structures and partial webbing between fingers and toes, changes impossible to attribute to normal decomposition. The most recent documented incident occurred in 1969, when a family boating on the lake reported their radio suddenly switching from music to what they described as underwater singing human voices, but wrong. Their 8-year-old daughter, previously terrified of water, became transfixed and tried to dive overboard before being restrained. For weeks afterward, she spoke of people calling from under the lake and drew figures with elongated limbs and features more fish than human. Whatever resonance Reverend Lawson sought to establish between flesh and water, between the human vessel and what he believed dwelled in the spring beneath his chapel, may not have ended on that stormy night in 1872. Perhaps it merely changed form, becoming diffuse, but no less present a ripple still expanding outward, beyond the boundaries of Arkansas Hills, carried by waters that never stopped flowing. In her final recovered note written from her hospital bed, Dr. Holloway reflected, "Sound travels differently through water than through air, more efficiently, with less distortion over distance. The human body is approximately 60% water." Perhaps Lawson understood something fundamental about our nature that science has yet to fully comprehend. We are not merely terrestrial beings who occasionally interact with water. We are primarily aquatic in our internal composition. The boundary between our watery interior and the waters that surround us is perhaps more permeable than we care to acknowledge. What if that boundary can be dissolved through the right resonance? What if the waters within us can be made to recognize and respond to the waters without? And most disturbing of all, what if something dwells within those external waters that seeks communion with the waters we contain within ourselves? I hear it now, she wrote, not with my ears, but with something deeper, singing that calls to the very fluids that comprise my physical form. They say water has no memory, but I have come to believe otherwise. Water remembers, water connects, and water waits patient beyond human reckoning. Her investigation ended there. No academic institution has since authorized further research into the Lawson Chapel incident or its apparent aftermath. The Baptist Historical Society maintains no record of Thomas Lawson or his chapel in its official archives. The coordinates remain unmarked on public maps of Beaver Lake, though certain government surveys list Area 17 with the notation, "No diving authorized." And so the waters of Beaver Lake continue to flow over what remains of Lawson Chapel, carrying their secrets downstream to the White River, then to the Mississippi, and eventually to the ocean, where all waters converge. What harmonies might resonate there in the deepest places where light never reaches remains beyond our knowing. But sometimes at night when rain falls on still water, listen carefully. You might hear something like distant singing, something not quite human, not quite other, calling from beneath the surface. If you do remember the story of Reverend Thomas Lawson and his chapel, before you let your ears linger too long on that resonant harmony. Some songs once heard continue to echo within the waters of your own body, long after the external sound has ceased, and the boundary between listener and what is listened for may prove more permeable than you ever imagined.